Welcome to Mining the Media, providing nuggets of news and cutting-edge questions and answers, minus the political blather. Here are your hosts, G.K. Allen and Dave Jeffers.
Well, welcome everybody. This is Dave Jeffers, co-host of Mining the Media, and calling in from Clearwater, Florida, Mr. G.K. Allen, the creator and co-host of Mining the Media. Greg, G.K., welcome. Glad to have you.
Yeah, GK is the name I used when I first started out as a freelance writer, and I've decided to use it more than my everyday name, if you will, only as a sort of a bookend. You know, I started out as GK, and later on in life right now, I think I'm going to become GK again as my preference, but you can call me either one.
Well, you know what's funny is I have me a little sticky note right here below. It says GK, not Greg. So I was bound to screw that up. Every time I try to set myself up for success, it's like, man, just riff, dude. Don't even try to be so. So tell us about yourself. You kind of just told us about the start, how you started out. Give us a little bit of bio of who G.K. Allen is.
Well, I got hooked on radio at the age of 2.5 because my parents did a radio show in Albany, New York. And at the age of 2.5, a long time ago, a lot of the stations still had bands playing live in the studio. And my parents did a show called Ad-Libbing with the Allens. And they would bring me in to the studio and put me on the piano bench. And the piano had no cover on the keys. And I remember my mom telling me and my dad telling me, when that light is on, referring to the on-air light, don't touch the piano keys. In fact, don't touch them at all. And to make a long story short, at the age of 2.5, I fell in love with radio, not because of the sound, but because of the look. My eyes fell in love with radio because through the glass, where back then they had glowing tubes galore and more than one board operator, it was a fascinating thing to watch. And I knew my parents were up to something because they were talking to all these people around the table. So I literally fell in love with radio visually. And then I wound up listening to people like Bob and Ray and Long John Neville later on and Barry Farber. And I think it's important to remember those pioneers as well, because Rush is getting a lot of the credit he deserves. But Rush Limbaugh was not the first to break the ice. And I think that's important as well. Yeah. So that's how I got hooked early on into radio.
And that's and I think I've heard Rush refer to Barry Farber before when he was doing his show. So
I was on his show a few times, and Barry was a wonderful, wonderful man. And I returned the favor years later when I was doing one of my syndicated shows, and he was a frequent guest on the show. Barry Farber was truly a pioneer and a very good, I mean, he knew history. He really knew history. He was one of the good souls. He really was a very fine human being.
I remember when you would have him a couple of times, and I actually used to read his articles. I think he wrote for Newsmax at times. And
he did a lot of freelance writing, no doubt about that. And he had a good long life. And I was on his show when he was on WMCA in New York quite a few times.
Good. So I'm out driving around on Mary Esther Cutoff today. I'm looking for somewhere for lunch, and I almost pull into Panera Bread just for old time's sake. But I opted for Korean food anyway. But I remember you and I are having lunch. You were up here for a little while back in 2014, and we were actually having lunch at Panera Bread, and you dropped this little nugget about a show idea you have called Mining the Media. And I'm like, oh man, I'm buying that website today before that gets stolen. And I've owned it ever since, and we're finally getting this off the ground. So GK, what was the impetus of this idea? How did this come about?
Well, basically, in all the years that I did The Right Balance, and before that I did a network show called Him and Her with Greg and Fran, and did a lot of local radio in Florida as well prior to that, I just felt that mining the media was a good way to find the nuggets. And what I'm talking about is one of the strengths I had, and I'm not patting myself on the back, but I actually am patting myself on the back, long before I was in radio, when I was a music critic, and then when I got into talk radio, so on and so forth. I've always been good at seeing either the upcoming recording artist who's got the first album out that I think is going to be hot, or the news item of the day that's falling through the cracks. Because the problem, forget whether you're liberal or conservative. The fact is that if you watch NBC, CBS, any of these news broadcasts for 30 minutes, you have no idea what's really going on in the world. And if it's not exploding, they may not talk about it. When you watch any of the American over-the-air news networks, you literally don't. Do they have an African desk anymore? No. Do they have a South American desk? No. Do you ever hear about some of the stories falling through the cracks? There's an awful lot of things going on in India that people should know about. There's a lot of things going on in Southeast Asia that people should know about, and there's stuff going on in our backyard. And my point is, if you really want, when I was doing show prep for my other shows, I would see stories that literally were falling through the cracks. So I felt calling it mining the media, parenthesis for nuggets of news, just trying to find some of the items that we should talk about and aren't talking about. I'm going to give an example right now. We're talking a lot about climate change. I'm of many different minds on this particular issue, and bear with me. I think it's very, very important, whether you're hearing someone who is very much for climate change or very, very skeptical. Ask yourself this question and try to avoid any preferences you have politically. Who's paying for that person you're listening to? Who's funding the pro guy or the con guy? And I think it's very important to know that. And as it affects climate change, talk about nuggets of news, one of the nuggets I think I'm mining myself is the fact that we tend to blame it all on human beings. But bear with me, Dave. Climate change to a great extent, and because some of this involves a long period of time and some of it doesn't. We have the magnetic North Pole and we have the magnetic South Pole. I think people think the pole's always in the same position. It's not. And over time, it affects the tides. It affects where the sun shines and where it doesn't. It's not a thing that happens in 24 hours. Again, it's over time. It's one of the things that affects climate change and always has and always will. No one ever refers to that. They also don't refer to the core of the Earth. We know more about the moon than we do about the core of the Earth. And from the core of the Earth, the ocean's floors crack and they get hot and they get cold and they get bubbly. We've got something known as the Gulf Stream. Well, the Gulf Stream wasn't always there. Brazil was once attached to West Africa. Things change. Climate changes. And then we have solar flares. And this is, to me, the biggest thing to talk about and doesn't get enough attention. The fact is that solar flares, the sun is growing and getting hotter big time. And solar flares are getting more powerful big time. And they are affecting the Earth big time. Are human beings affecting climate change? I think to a great extent. It's been exaggerated, but I'm not a skeptic. But I do think it has been exaggerated. Do we contribute to it? Probably. Here's where we do contribute things that cannot be argued. We contribute to polluting the air and polluting the water. We need to get very serious about something that's the world's least sexy topic, water. We better get very serious about that because that transcends piston cars, electric cars, liberal, conservative, black or white, straight or gay. Everything needs water, and we're not being serious enough about retaining it. Dave, we live in Florida, you and I. The fact is we have a rainy season in Florida. Do we hold on to the water we get during the rainy season? No. Why don't we have serious ways of retaining water so when there's a drought in Arizona, for example, there's a pipeline from Florida that can help them? Or we keep the water for ourselves because we have a dry season as well. So basically, when it comes to climate change, I would say we have to realize that forces of nature from the core of the Earth, the magnetic North and South poles, and the solar flares have more to do with it than anything John Kerry's talking about.
I like that. And that just kind of gives us an idea of, the things you're looking at and where you're at. And people, what people don't know about you is well, when you were younger, you first got involved in politics as a young Goldwater
Yeah.
Republican back, what, 1964?
Yeah, I campaigned for him in the Teenage Republican Club. I sure did. I got to meet him very, very briefly at Newark Airport, and I knew he wasn't going to win. We all knew that.
Right.
But what's funny about that is going back to 1964 when I was a young kid, the vulgarities that were hurled our way, because we were in a very heavily Democratic part of the world where I was living at the time. And the things that people were saying to 14 and 15-year-old kids, even back then, because obviously the vulgarity level has radically increased over the years, which is really a shame. And I do want to point out, since this is sort of our toe in the water, that I have thought very carefully as how do I want to represent myself with what we're doing? Because frankly, I've had it with the Washington, D.C. federal issues when it comes to politics, and bear with me. I can no longer say I'm a Republican because I don't like the party. I'm certainly not a Democrat because they've been taken over by people, I think, who really don't treasure this country or value its worth. I don't like Republicans. I don't like Democrats. I don't like Nazis. I don't like socialists. I don't like Maoists. I have become, Dave, and maybe other people want to catch this phrase if they think the way I do and feel the way I do. I am now a political atheist. I don't believe in Republicans. I don't believe in Democrats. I'm sick of the parties. They're creating problems. Politics right now is not solving problems. Politics is dividing us. Politics is not listening to each other. Politics has gotten to the point right now where stereotyping is coming in, where, especially with the hard left, everything they're about is if you're white, you must be this. If you're black, you must be this. A Jew or a black person or a gay person couldn't possibly be conservative. It's not the right thing to be. I think we're getting into an age where both sides are intolerant. I think the intolerance is more from the left at the moment than from the right. But what I find so interesting is that people right now are seeing, well, if you're white, this is what you must be. Well, look, as a former music critic, here's what I got to say to them. With this attitude that these stereotyping people are big on, are you going to tell me that Leontine Price couldn't sing opera? A brilliant black singer couldn't sing opera? Are you telling me that Eric Clapton can't play the blues because he's white? Screw it. I'm tired of this crap. I really, really am.
Yeah. And I remember when I barely remember 1964 politics. I do. That's the first thing I remember. But I went back and I watched Ronald Reagan's speech where he left the Democrat Party and he said, well, I didn't leave the party, they left me. And I'm not a political atheist because I think I'm more of a refugee. I'm roaming around trying to find somebody who's really going to actually help me and not disappoint me and not lie to me and not use me. And I think that what we want to do with this show is just show people, look, these are the facts. Here's and cut through all that. I mean, white privilege is so toxic now that the Oakland mayor is going to give out $500 a month to poor families unless you're white. If you're white and you're poor, well, you're still part of the white privilege. So I don't care if you're living in a ghetto. I don't care if you're homeless. If you're white, we're not going to help you. And this, I mean, it has become the conscience of our country has become so corrupted and
intolerant.
It's unbelievable. It's literally what Isaiah 5:20 says. Woe to the nation that calls good evil and evil good. Woe to our nation is what
One of the most dangerous things we have, Dave. Truth really matters. And again, I'm truly, genuinely sick of both sides. I still retain basically conservative, libertarian, a dash of moderate in my political mix, but I cannot back the Republican Party because they are not remotely unified and they're frankly inept. And they remind me very much, as the Democrats try to talk about, bipartisanship, and the Republicans go to a used car lot run by Democrats. The Republicans are hoping to find a used Lexus, and they wind up driving away, with a used Yugo. thinking they've had some kind of victory. The problem is right now that both political parties are run by too many old people, and I'm a fairly old person myself. But when you look at the age of our president, when you look at the age of Mitch McConnell, when you look at the age of Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, Republicans and Democrats across the board, there have been too many people who frankly are too old, who've been around too long. And for the sake of the country, regardless of your political preference, I think it's time to have term limits, 12 years. That would be 6 in the House, 2 in the Senate, keep the president at 8. I think that makes sense because our founding fathers were right. When you're done, and Washington understood it, when you're done, go back to your printing press, go back to your farm, whatever it happens to be, and become a citizen again. We have problems in Washington because whether it's a Republican or a Democrat senator, they go to the same country club, they go to the same call girls, they go to the same everything, and it's become incestuous.
Yeah. And just so everybody knows that, we're going to talk about politics. We're going to talk about culture. We'll probably talk about religion. We're going to talk about things that are going on that need clarity. The byline for our show is that the Mining the Media is not your typical talk radio, shout radio, even listen radio. We ask smart questions, provide informative answers, and are forward thinking. This is Think Radio. All capital letters, think, THINK. We want you to think, folks. We believe that you have the ability, and if you don't have the ability, we're going to help you critically think. We're going to give you some facts. We'll analyze some of the facts, and if we're given our opinion, we'll tell you it's our opinion. But we trust you to use your common sense, use your logic, and then come up with an answer. Because
and you're absolutely right, Dave. And also, one of the things I've often enjoyed most is realizing that it's really healthy to speak to people who agree with you and to speak to people who disagree with you. Because right now we're living in an age where you either is or you ain't. You're with me or you're against me. And I think it's really, really sad. We have a severe lack of empathy in our culture right now and in our politics. And I think the golden rule matters. And I think the First Amendment matters. And those are two of my nuggets, if you will, in the way I see the world. I believe we need to have the golden rule in our lives, and we need to treasure the First Amendment because the American experiment has been flawed at times, no doubt about it. But comparatively speaking, we're pretty darn good.
Yeah, man is sinful, we're born with a sinful nature. I know people think we're born naturally good, but if you believe that and you've had children, that should have been proved to you to be wrong at about the 6-month mark when they were. I always tell the story about it probably had to be closer to 9-10 months old. My grandson, they were down visiting, and my son-in-law was out doing something, I think, and my wife and daughter, my oldest daughter Tiffany, wanted to go and do something. I said, "Well, you can leave him with me. Grampy still remembers how to change diapers." Well, my wife Karen, she's Mima. She has a magazine rack down there by the TV, and he'd been wanting to get into that, and Mommy wouldn't let him get into it. So I'm sitting in my recliner, and he's sitting up. Now I'm telling you, he's crawling. He's not walking yet. He's crawling. So I forget how old what was going on. Must have been, could have been in the summer. I forget. Nevertheless, he spots it, and I'm watching him. I'm like, man, I should be recording this. This is a great experiment in child behavior. And so he starts crawling over towards the magazine rack, and he stops, and he just sits back up, and he kind of looks over his shoulder because I'm there, and I'm just watching. I haven't said a word. He crawls a little bit more, sits back up. He does this about 3 or 4 times, and finally he turns around and looks at me, and I'm just looking at him. And he sits there and he stares at it, and then finally he reaches out, and the minute he touches the magazine, I say, "No, Benjamin." And then of course he threw a fit and got mad. But it just shows you that even though we are we do have a sinful nature, and we need to be taught how to behave. I think we as a nation need to be taught how to behave again, to listen. And I've been guilty of this in the past. I've always joked that, I kind of have an autoresponder email that says, please forgive me for my last email that was totally unchristian-like and I shouldn't have came at you that way. And that's really why I pretty much have by about 85% gotten off social media, mainly because I find it sometimes to be very, very toxic. And most people now are getting all their information from social media. And it can be a good thing.
And there's a lot of dangers there, Dave, a lot of dangers, because we're living in an age now where someone's accused of something and the verdict is, the accusation becomes the verdict. So, something's on social media at 10 o'clock in the morning, and whatever the topic is, who's ever being, assassinated in the social media, the verdict and the accusation are one and the same, which is a very dangerous thing.
Yeah,
most things in life that need a little bit of time to figure out what is and what ain't.
Right. Look at the shooter out in Boulder, Colorado last week. He was called a white Christian. He's Syrian. He's Muslim. And no one will come back. And now some of them will delete the tweet. And some people have deleted the tweet. Some people, and they just said, oh, well, we jumped the gun. And talk about stereotyping. Our vice president did that. And I said, talk about stereotyping. The guy was what you just assumed that there was a shooting and it was a white Christian who did it, which is rarely the case. Rarely the case.
Well, can you imagine, speaking of our vice president, and boy, it's been a long time since we've had a good president. I'm sick and tired of voting, this voting against someone rather than for someone. I'm really tired of that. The most recent presidential elections, I basically voted against somebody rather than for somebody. But with Kamala Harris, can you imagine her ancestors were slave owners in Jamaica? Can you imagine if any Republican of note had slave owners, a lineage where there were slave owners, and this is the thing, that doesn't make her a slave owner. That's part of the problem too. What happened 100 years ago or 200 years ago or 300 years ago? Well, guess what? If you're a contemporary German and you're 35 years old, you can't be accused of being a Nazi. You're 35 years old. You weren't around then.
And that's a great point, because I don't hold Kamala Harris responsible for what her ancestors did. She wasn't even alive. But and I want the listeners to know that even though GK and I have conservative backgrounds, we are not cheerleaders. We want to point out.
No, definitely not.
We want to point out the facts about everything. So if we see something that's catching a lot, now we're not going to wade into every argument because there's so many of them, and so many of them are irrelevant to the real issues of the day. We're just going to ignore them. We're not going to go there. There's enough people out there that are going to do all that clickbait nonsense that you can get anywhere. We want to talk seriously. We're going to concentrate on a few topics. And one thing we're going to do, and the way this came about, it's funny because the way you and I are talking right now is the way we talk on the phone, every day. I'll be driving from work downtown, and these are the things we have, the conversations we have. And then what you'll always end up doing, and I told you, I want this to be the last segment of the show because we're always going to end up on a really cool note, uplifting note. But GK has the most phenomenal, he's encyclopedic when it comes to music. He was a music critic. But the way he can throw these little music nugget memories out of his mind always blows me and my wife Karen away. So I told him, I said, at the end of every show, we're going to have about a 5-minute segment where we're going to do a music memory, GK music memory. And so to end this introductory segment, why don't you give us a music memory nugget?
Well, this is something of a historical comment I'm about to make. It doesn't pertain to me as a songwriter or a former drummer or any of that. It's as a critic right now. You're asking me as the critic I used to be. To me, the most important single, instrumental, in the history of rock and roll was a song called Telstar by the Tornadoes, a British band.
Right.
They were produced by a guy named Joe Meek, M-E-E-K, who was a brilliant producer, an absolute raving lunatic, brilliant producer. Telstar should be heard by anyone who wasn't around to hear it back around 1963, because an answer to a trivia question is, who was the first British rock band to have a #1 hit in America in the 1960s? And it was not the Beatles. It was the Tornadoes. They predated the Beatles by about 11 months. Why am I talking about Telstar? Why do I consider it the most important single instrumental in the history of rock and roll? Because it was computer, because it was synthesizer before anyone had computers or synthesizers. The production values that Joe Meek used to get the spacey sounds, because it was a tribute to the Telstar satellite.
Right.
The work he did to bounce stuff back and forth between 4-track machines, which were the cutting edge back then, and the way he got sound effects was just absolutely amazing. And this song, literally, nothing sounded like it until it came along. So I would suggest to anybody who isn't old enough to have been around then, if you want to go back, because I know an awful lot of young people I talk to, and college kids and high school kids and younger members in my family, they like hearing something from the past. They like being told about this. So check out Telstar by the Tornadoes, a brilliant instrumental, realizing, of course, that it was recorded in the time when nobody had a synthesizer, because they did not exist, and no one had a computer musically. Brilliant, brilliant song. Absolutely fantastic. Later on, a few years after that, there's another song to give a quick plug to, because I'm a big believer that certain songs really are unique and really sound like, they don't sound like anything that came before them. Certainly Telstar's that. Another one is a vocal. The Beach Boys' Good Vibrations is a masterpiece. It's a masterpiece. It's as good as anything from Duke Ellington or Mozart. It's a masterpiece.
Wow.
That's simple. Enough said.
Being a California kid who grew up on the Beach Boys, I appreciate that. I really appreciate the time, GK. I'm looking forward to doing this. And folks, for those of you who are listening in or are going to hear the recording of this, our plan is to launch on May 17th. That'll be a Wednesday. Our hope is to have 3, 4, maybe 2, 3, maybe 4 segments to come out right away, so that you don't have to wait. It's going to be a weekly podcast, but we're going to launch out with about 3 or 4, and they'll be on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts. Because we don't just want to whet the appetite. We want to give you a full serving, and then you'll come back every week to get your supplements and of Mining the Media. And we have a lot of other things in plan. But what we need from you, we need 2 things. Primarily on May 17th, when we do launch, we need you to go to where you get your podcast. We need you to download. We need you to subscribe. We need you to tell everybody you know to do the same thing. And if you like our podcast, we would so appreciate a 5-star rating and a great comment. If you don't like it, we don't want you to lie, but maybe you just don't say anything, you know. Mama said, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. So, but that would help us tremendously. We want to hit the top charts on iTunes, especially for a new podcast. And the only way that's going to happen is if you folks do that for us. We can't do that on our own. We need you to do that. We need you to spread the word through social media, through email, through everybody you know. It's so quick and easy to do that. Most people have podcasts, so if you'll do that. The other thing, if you feel, go to our website for sure. Go to miningthemedia.com. You can learn a little bit more about us. That's miningthemedia.com. And if you feel so inclined to help us, because there's some startup costs that we have. We have to buy equipment, pay for web hosting and all that other stuff. We have a GoFundMe site. It's at our website. This is what the website looks like right in back here. And right below that banner, when you get to our website, there's a little link that says support our show. If you click on that, it'll send you to our GoFundMe site. And anything you can give, we would appreciate that. That's going to help us buy equipment. get up and running. And we're excited. We hope you are too. We hope you spread the word. And we're not going to be doing this stuff live because we're going to record it and stuff. Every once in a while, we'll do a live show if something comes up. Maybe we'll do a 4th of July show or something like that. We'll see that, and we'll get your feedback will help us too to let us know. So we're always interested in feedback. You can contact us too at the website. There's a contact page or a sheet there. Just scroll down on the website, and you can contact us and let us know what you think. Give us some ideas. Ask us some questions. Maybe we can cover some topics. Maybe you've heard of something that's unique in the media. That's good news. That's not being covered. Let us know about that too. Just go to the website miningthemedia.com and follow us. I'm going to start up a Facebook page too, probably for Mining the Media, just so that there's a lot of people like to go to Facebook. We can post stuff there too. So last words, GK, before we call it a night.
I'm going to make a prediction. Probably the most dramatic thing I've said in these 30 minutes. I predict, just like Criswell used to predict, I predict that the members-only jacket will make a comeback. There you have it.
Look at you. Man, I used to have one of those. What did I do with it? Can you even get them?
I had a beautiful red one. I loved it. They were so comfortable. I'm hoping they come back.
Can you get one anywhere?
I don't know. Go to a used clothing store somewhere. There's probably some rock bands in England right now that think it's cool.
Probably get them on eBay for about $500 a piece.
And keep in mind too, with the music thing, down the road, I'll tell people when I interviewed Tom Petty long before anybody knew who he was.
Yeah, and maybe you can tell them about your chance meeting of John Lennon once in New York City. That's one of my favorites.
Oh, that was not pleasant, but it was informative.
I know, but I love that story.
That's when he broke up with Yoko Ono and was throwing his weight around in a recording studio. But I'd rather accentuate the positive because he wrote one of my all-time favorite songs in my life. Was the song I danced with my daughter when she got married. That's the song we danced to. That was one of the most amazing songs ever. So I'd rather not badmouth him. It was an unpleasant situation, but he was an amazingly talented guy.
It was indeed. All right, my friend. Folks, thanks for tuning in. Or if you haven't heard this, you're listening to this recorded. We'd love to hear what you think about it. You can put some comments there at Facebook, or better yet, visit our website. We'd love to hear from you at the website. Let us know you're getting there and tell us what you think about it. So until then, folks, we'll talk to you later. We'll see you on the other side. God bless everybody and stay safe this weekend.